There was one aircraft that was just as at home on a reconnaissance mission at 30,000 feet as it was skimming at treetop level, taking the fight to the enemy's door. Capable of carrying a 4,000-pound bomb load, it could smash its target with pinpoint accuracy or deliver a 6-pound shell against a U-boat. Nothing was safe from its fury. Yet this aircraft was ridiculed from the start. In what seemed like a step back in design, it had no armour plating. It only had a crew of 2, a pilot and an observer. And even more for the time, the entire airframe was made of wood. But by the end of its life, nearly 8,000 had been manufactured. During the Second World War, it won the hearts of all who flew in it and became a legend in its own lifetime. It was the de Havilland Mosquito. The best aircraft, in both peace and war, have often also been the fastest. The pursuit of speed has been part of the appeal of aviation from its earliest days. And often it's the most innovative and radical designs that break speed records. Throughout the 1930s, one British aircraft designer was obsessed with speed above all else. But the material he used was regarded as obsolete in the aviation industry. The material? Wood. The designer? Geoffrey de Havilland. De Havilland knew that lightweight wooden aircraft were the key to greater speeds. In 1934, his twin-engine Comet won the London to Melbourne air race. With speeds of over 200 miles an hour, it took just 77 hours. A ship would take 4 weeks. The world was amazed. But the happy times were about to come to an end. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power and set about rebuilding the German force. Incorporating the latest innovations, many of its aircraft were years ahead of anything the British possessed. During the Spanish Civil War, the Luftwaffe took to the air in anger for the first time. Its effect was devastating.
It took the British quite a while to realise that the Germans had innovative designs, monoplane fighters, but more importantly, they had medium bombers that were being developed, and they had, in effect, tested them in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 onwards. It's a huge wake-up call.
The British had to respond. New, modern aircraft were needed to counter any threat from Germany. But at the time, British opinion held that the future of air power lay in strategic bombing by large conventional bombers. Any ideas about radical lightweight bombers were scoffed at. But Geoffrey de Havilland had other ideas. Based on his experience of building the Comet, he determined to build a new, super light, fast, high-precision bomber. His dream was to construct a cheap, easy-to-build aircraft. Amazingly, it would have no guns, no armour plating, it could carry up to 4,000 pounds of explosives, and with a speed of nearly 400 miles an hour, it would be faster than any other aircraft in the world. But the most amazing aspect of this plane was that it would be made entirely of wood. The aviation experts and the military authorities thought this was all absolute nonsense. How could you build a modern bomber out of wood? How would it carry bombs? How could you protect the crew? But de Havilland had all the answers. It wouldn't need to protect itself. Its defence would be speed. As far as strength is concerned, pound for pound, timber has similar structural properties to aluminium or steel.
There's a shortage in Britain in the late 1930s of metal workers, of people skilled in the new technologies of fighter aeroplanes, of bomber aeroplanes. What you did have, though, was a nation of cabinet builders, of woodworkers, of individual small craftsmen. More importantly, you can actually mobilize all of these people to build it, and you can make it, in effect, a cottage industry.
In September 1939,
war in Europe erupted, and de Havilland was at last given the green light to build his prototype aircraft. Immediately, the design team went into overdrive. They moved into Salisbury Hall, a remote 17th century manor house, chosen to keep the new aircraft away from prying eyes. Work began by building a mock-up aircraft in the manor's enormous kitchen, whilst a hangar, disguised as a barn, was constructed at the western side of the moat.
We were working often periods of time, 6.5 days a week, and at some periods from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night.
De Havilland was desperate to get his plane into the air. But in the spring of 1940, Germany conquered France, and the British Army was swept off the beaches of Dunkirk. With Britain fighting for her life, priority was given to building only existing types of combat aircraft. Geoffrey de Havilland's radical new wooden bomber looked condemned to be scrapped. But de Havilland wasn't a man to take no for an answer.
Sir Geoffrey's words are, well, they may not want it now, but they will want it.
De Havilland persuaded the Air Ministry to let him continue as long as he didn't use any of the vital materials required for the war effort. Crucially, wood wasn't on their list. Throughout the summer of 1940, as the Royal Air Force fought for control of the air against the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, de Havilland's team worked on their wooden bomber.
Finally, in December 1940, the aircraft was ready to be shown to the Air Ministry. It was to be called the Mosquito. Without access to any strategic materials, de Havilland and his team had done their best. But would it be good enough to convince the men from the ministry?
We knew it would fly. We were absolutely confident it would. And the question is how much better than the Spitfire it would be. Of course, we said it would be, and it was. 20 miles an hour faster.
The Air Ministry was so impressed that they placed an order for 150 Mosquitoes. It was an amazing contract for an untried and untested aircraft. It was a huge order, but de Havilland had a construction plan that would enable the Mosquito to be built in vast numbers. It was to be built like a model aircraft, with wood, plywood, glue and screws. Over 400 companies around Britain, with woodworking craftsmen, would make the various sections. Fuselage would be made in 2 halves before being bonded together. The wing would be assembled in one piece and then transported to the main factory for the final assembly. In all, over 6 tons of wood and nearly 50,000 brass screws were used in each aircraft.
At 44 feet long and with a wingspan of 54 feet, a legend was born. And with a top speed of 407 miles an hour, faster than any other aircraft in the world at the time, the Mosquito was ready for battle.
The Royal Air Force viewed the aircraft as far too valuable to let just anybody fly them. But even for the most experienced crews, the Mosquito, powered by its 2 mighty Merlin engines, was unlike anything they'd ever flown before.
The purr of a Merlin is something to experience, it really is. And then we taxied out and took off.
There you were, you suddenly look at the altimeter. The 1 minute you're down at 1,000 feet, next minute you're up at 30,000.
She would climb at 2,500 feet a minute, and that was really going some. You had to get into a jet to fly anything faster than that. If you started to mishandle her, pushing and pulling, in no time at all you would over-control, and she would be she would sting you.
In July 1941, The first Mosquitoes to go into service were delivered to photo-reconnaissance units. It had taken only 22 months from the first drawings to delivery. Bristling with up to 5 cameras, these aircraft were soon sweeping all over Europe, evading anti-aircraft guns and fighters. The Germans had nowhere to hide. Nothing was safe from the Mosquitoes' prying eyes.
Photo reconnaissance was vital. We're talking the days before satellites, the days when human intelligence on the ground was limited. It was difficult to get back good information. Before every single bomber command raid over enemy targets, they had to take pictures of the targets. They, in fact, had to report the weather as well. So the Mosquito was an ideal aeroplane for that. In fact, you could say probably it was the best aircraft for this.
But it wasn't long before the highly versatile Mosquito was adapted to take on another, much more aggressive role. Armed with a payload of 4,000 pounds of bombs, the Mossie joined the Royal Air Force's heavy bombers in the air campaign, attacking German towns night after night.
By mid-1943, the Mosquitoes were bombing Berlin on such a regular basis that it became known as the Berlin Express. But for the Mosquito crews, there was no such thing as just a routine mission.
We would take off perhaps 2 hours after the Lancasters had gone, and it was at that time that I really felt lonely.
And it was at that point that you could start thinking about what you were doing. You had to rely entirely on the navigator who had radar aids and things like that. But then with the night closing in on you, you suddenly realised that you'd left your homeland behind and you were heading for you knew not what.
After 2 hours, the Mosquitoes caught up with the Lancasters heading for Germany. Flying at 25,000, the Mosquito crews looked down on the procession of bombers below them.
And then you would probably be treated to a sight you would rather not see, which was the German night fighter force intercepting the Lancasters. I mean, it's true to say that once the German night fighters found the bomber stream, they didn't let go. And they'd be there, hammering away at the flanks of the heavies, and you'd see a sheet of flame as a Lanc caught fire and then blew up. And this would be the melancholy procession to the target and out of it too. It was just awful.
But it wasn't just night fighters that they had to get past. Like icy fingers of death, German searchlights hunted for any Allied plane in the sky.
The favourite thing for them to do was to pick up somebody with a searchlight and then fasten all other searchlights onto it. So it was like a moth in a candle flame, and it wasn't very long before you saw brr, 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 one-way tracer going, and then an explosion as a Lanc or a Halifax went down.
The most frightful glare suddenly hit the cockpit, and this blinding light, and I realised what it was, but at the same time, this bloody tracer came shooting past. So I just dived and twisted, and I got out of it.
You could twist and turn if you wanted to, but generally speaking, they would hold you as you twisted and turned, follow you. The way to get out was to dive, so you could do a screaming dive and quickly fly away.
Eventually, the Mosquitoes and the Lancasters made it to their target. Having dropped their bombs, they then had to fly back through the searchlights before they could get back to Britain. For those crews who did return, the Royal Air Force always found a way of cushioning them from the stark realities of war.
People came back shot up, and one thing I did notice about the bomber airfields, of course, no one was ever sick. You never saw an injured man around the place. If people arrived wounded, he'd be quickly spirited away. Everybody next day was there, booted and spurred and smiling. Nobody was dead, or if they were dead, they weren't there anyway.
Despite the losses, the Mosquitoes dealt a severe blow to the enemy. One squadron completed nearly 200 operations within a year, and Mosquitoes bombed Berlin 220 nights in a row. But the Mosquito would prove even more deadly when undertaking fast, low-level daylight raids, using its speed and agility to attack high-profile targets with pinpoint precision. During the early part of the Second World War, bombing had been a case of hit or miss. Aircraft flying at 16,000 feet dropped their bombs in huge numbers, trusting on luck, weather and flying skill to hit their targets. But the bomber version of the Mosquito changed all that.
We had to be under 50 feet to be under the radar. That's the whole point of low-level operations, so the Germans don't know you're coming. And then, of course, you had to go low over the target as possible, so that you took them hopefully by surprise.
Some daylight raids were flown at such low altitudes that Mosquitoes would often come back with strange souvenirs from their mission.
Many a Mossie pilots come back with telephone wires draped round his tail wheel. I know I've come back with branches of trees that weren't planted in England.
Mosquito squadrons were becoming more and more daring in their attacks. None more so than the daylight raid against the Dutch Philips radio factory in Eindhoven.
Intelligence had discovered that the Germans were using this factory to develop radar countermeasures, so it had to be destroyed.
Before the raid, one pilot put his life on the line in a photo-reconnaissance mission.
They sent for me 3 days or 4 days before the raid and said, I've got a special job I want you to do. We've got a cameraman coming up, and I want you to fly with him down the Scheldt estuary, right down as far as Holland itself, and then turn round, come back, taking a film of the route which we will all be taking to Eindhoven.
On December the 6th, 1942, having watched the reconnaissance footage, 10 Mosquito crews headed for their target.
We went low level down the Scheldt estuary into Holland. And then just then we were approaching a place I think called Turnhout. And at that point we had to climb up to 1,000 feet. And then we turned to port, and up came the factory and went down in a screaming dive and dropped our bombs straight into it.
Mission accomplished, but now the Germans knew they were there, and they'd hound the raiders every inch of their long journey home.
Soon the Mosquitoes were caught in German anti-aircraft fire. Over the North Sea, disaster struck.
The chap who decided to follow me, because he was on his first trip and he thought he'd follow an experienced pilot, and I'm afraid he caught a bit of flack because my cameraman suddenly called out, looking backwards, God, he'd gone into the sea. I've turned round and went back to the sea. And there was no dinghy or anything, just a cauldron of boiling water.
Just 6 weeks later, on the 30th of January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's coming to power, the Mosquitoes set off on yet another audacious raid.
Intelligence had discovered that there was to be a major Nazi rally in Berlin, led by Reich propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, which was to be broadcast on German radio. This was too good an opportunity to miss. The aim was not to hit the site of the rally, but to create chaos and interrupt the broadcast.
As planned, 3 Mosquitoes hit Berlin at 11 a.m, interrupting Göring's broadcast. And then a second group attacked at 4 p.m. discomforting Goebbels. For the Allies, it was a major propaganda coup.
The Mosquito delivered to the Allies, particularly to the British, propaganda coups right the way through its service history, and all done by a small wooden aeroplane that the Germans had written off in their propaganda as being some sort of antique.
Later, Goering was quoted as saying, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building. They give it a speed, which they've increased again."
But Goering had seen nothing yet. The plane that he loved to hate was about to take part in an even more extraordinary raid. A mission that would ensure the Mosquito becoming a legend of the Second World War. Ever since it had entered service, the 400 miles an hour wooden Mosquito had been thrown into battle with startling results. Whatever role it had been asked to fill, the Mosquito had risen to the challenge. But now it was about to take part in one of the most daring raids of the entire war.
While the French resistance had little effect on the course of the war, with its aim of sabotaging the German war effort, it was undoubtedly a nuisance. By 1944, hundreds of resistance members had been imprisoned at the notorious Amiens prison in northern France, and word had reached the Allies that on February the 19th, 200 of them would be executed.
They had to be got out, so in London the planners began to examine the options. The prison needed to be blown apart, but without killing the inmates in the process. There was only one bit of kit for that job: the Mosquito.
An ingenious plan was hatched. Mosquitoes would be used to bomb the walls surrounding the prison so that the prisoners could escape. It was to be called Operation Jericho. The walls would come tumbling down. The main prison layout was in the shape of a crucifix and surrounded by a 20-foot high wall, 3 feet thick and topped with broken glass. The timing of the raid was vital. It had to be at midday when the prisoners were exercising in the yard and the guards were having lunch. The plan was complete. Now it was time for action. On the morning of the 14th of February, the crews of the 18 Mosquitoes were ready to go to Amiens. But as they waited for takeoff, it looked as if the raid might have to be cancelled. The weather had closed in and all aircraft were grounded.
It was very, very bad weather, low cloud and sort of spitting snow, do you know what I mean? Very low cloud. And we didn't think it would go on.
At the last possible moment, and with only 2 hours before the deadline, 18 Mosquitoes armed with 500-pound bombs took off in conditions worse than most of the crews had ever encountered.
Flying in 3 squadron groups, only 15 feet above the water, the wooden Mosquitoes swept across the channel. Now, this was a very hairy business. Judging height above water is difficult at the best of times, but in this sort of weather, cloud, sky and sea all merge into one. And with visibility further reduced by falling snow, the whole thing was really very dangerous indeed. The slightest tip of a wing could lead to disaster. Add to that the risk of hitting a bird, which could stove in a wing, wreck an engine, or smash a perspex windscreen. And the whole thing came down to the inherent skill and gut instincts of the pilots. Otherwise, it's a fatal accident waiting to happen.
Amazingly, as they approached the French coast, the weather improved. It seemed that luck was on their side.
We got to France. It was covered in snow, of course, but it was clear. And we flew round and we picked up the route from Amiens to Albert. long straight road, and we settled down for the run in.
In the fields around the prison, French resistance fighters searched the sky, anxiously waiting for the mosquitoes that they hoped would help their comrades escape.
We could see the prison ahead, and we got down very, very low indeed, and we were coming down to around about 190, 180 knots.
The pilot had to line up his aircraft by eye, only a few feet above the ground, and then release his bomb when he judged that the moment was right. The terrific speed of the Mosquito was no help here, because the bombs had to be released at no more than 124 miles an hour. Otherwise, when they hit the wall, they would fragment instead of exploding. It was a very hazardous business.
We opened our bomb doors about a mile from the prison, flying at about 10 to 15 feet, and we had to pull up to go over the walls. We'd let our bombs go, and they went through the base of the wall. I turned to starboard, and as I looked down, I saw the startled face of the machine gunner in the little cupola on top of the prison. We looked at each other, I suppose, and then I was down onto the deck in loose formation following the wing commander.
Today, the wall's been repaired, but you can just see here from the difference in pointing where it was breached. Inside, it was complete chaos. The snow-covered ground was blackened with fallen masonry. There was broken glass all over the place. Parts of the prison were on fire, and there were the screams of the injured prisoners and staff. At the same time, those criminals, political prisoners, and resistance fighters who'd survived were scrambling to get out through the holes in the walls.
Thanks to the daring deeds of the Mosquito crews that day, 255 prisoners escaped, although 37 were killed in the attack, along with 50 German guards.
As far as I can see, this was a brilliant piece of precision bombing. The first flight took out the walls, blew in the doors, allowed people to escape. The second flight took the walls down. In fact, they didn't need the third flight. I think it was a startling success because it would have demonstrated to the Germans that the Royal Air Force could place bombs wherever they wanted to across occupied Europe.
The Mosquito had proved itself the undisputed master of low-level precision bombing, but the Royal Air Force was constantly looking for different ways to use this amazing aircraft. From its early days, the Mosquito had been used by Coastal Command against enemy harbours, shipping and U-boat packs. But in 1944, the Mosquito was given an evil sting in its nose. Called the Tetsi Mosquito, it carried a Mollen 6-pounder gun with a kick like the proverbial mule. Firing armour-piercing shells, this awesome weapon was used against German shipping and U-boats sitting on the surface. Another potent evolution of the aircraft gave it 8 60-pound rockets. When they unleashed these terrifying weapons, it was equivalent to a broadside from a naval light cruiser. Once on target, nothing was safe from these fearsome mosquitoes. But perhaps the most deadly of the Mosquito family that came into service in the latter years of the war was the fighter version. Armed with 4 .303 machine guns, it could lay down a shattering storm of fire. During early trials, it was found that the flash of the guns was so intense that it momentarily blinded the crews. Modifications overcame this, and because of the grouping of the guns in the nose, Mosquito pilots now had a terrific concentration of firepower. The timing couldn't have been better. In June 1944, a new, devastating weapon would hit Britain.
As the Allies fought to expand their foothold in Europe, the Germans unleashed their new terror weapon, the V1. Launched from sites in northern France, these flying bombs took off from ramps like this. Their destination? London.
Flying at nearly 350 miles an hour, pretty well equal to the Mosquito's speed, and packed with high explosive, the V1s were filled with enough fuel to take them over the capital. Then, once they'd exhausted their fuel, down they came. Destroying these fast-flying bombs was a dangerous task. Quickly, Mosquito pilots devised ways to take these terror weapons out of the sky.
They would try and get some height and then swoop down on it and shoot it with cannon.
But obliterating a terror weapon could be life-threatening in more ways than one, as one pilot was to find out.
And he squirted at it with his cannon, but he was a bit too close and it flew to bits. And a bit of it came in through the front and pierced the dinghy that he was sitting on. It inflated in the cockpit, so up he came off his seat and up towards the roof. But he was very fortunate. He always carried a dagger down his boot. I don't know if he wanted to fight his way out of Germany, perhaps. He produced a dagger, stabbed the dinghy, and down it went, and he got home. When I heard the story, I was absolutely terrified, and I always carried a knife down my own boot after that, just in case.
The fighters got very good at shooting them down, as did the anti-aircraft guns on the English coast, and the numbers getting through rapidly declined. So much so that the mayor of one south coast town complained vociferously to the Air Ministry that the Royal Air Force were shooting down V-1s meant for London, which were actually landing on his town. His protests were ignored.
While the fighters were attacking the V-1s in the air, photo-reconnaissance mosquitoes were scouring France and Belgium, hunting down their launch sites.
As we got near the target, of course, the navigator would alert you to your position. Put your nose down onto the towards the ramp and the pillbox, and the pilot would release the bombs. We did, I think, over 3,000 sorties against them, and in the end, Hitler only launched 5 of them. And it was an ideal target for the Mosquito. The Mosquito was made for V-1 sites.
In all, mosquitoes destroyed 428 of these terror weapons.
With the British and the Americans getting closer to Germany, Wehrmacht resistance stiffened. It was vital for the Allied planners to know the exact locations and strengths of German forces, and agents behind the lines could help to supply this precious intelligence.
Both the British and the Americans used mosquitoes to work with their agents in occupied countries. The aircraft would fly along a predetermined 150-mile line. Inside the plane was a radio operator listening for the agent's message. When the Mosquito got to the area, the radio operator would begin calling the agent.
This is 5278, 5278, calling Z313131, and then wait for him to say, yes, I'm here, and give me the answering code.
Sometimes the Mosquito would fly along the designated route for hours before the agent answered. Being an agent with a radio in an occupied country was an exceedingly dangerous and lonely existence. The operator had to find somewhere where he could put up his antenna and use his set unobserved. That often meant hiding in a wood in the middle of the night. He had about a minute to transmit his message before German radio detection vehicles pinpointed him.
When you heard them, it was exciting. It was, look, I've got him, finally. Confirmed who he was, and his short messages would be such and such a unit is there, and they're going west on highway number so-and-so, and it's 2 battalions or whatever it is, and and we could get it back in 3-4 hours.
Many times, the agent never made contact. Sometimes it was because he or she couldn't find a safe place to open up their set, but often it was because they'd already been caught. Many
perhaps most French resistance cells had been penetrated by the Germans, and betrayal was a constant risk run by all agents, and particularly by radio operators.
Well, when time was up, and the pilot knew just how much petrol we had, we'd turn around, go back.
With the information gleaned from their agents on the ground and from photo-reconnaissance missions, Mosquito fighters were sent to hunt down enemy targets. As Allied troops fought their way forwards, the wooden planes targeted German supply lines to disrupt the enemy's logistic arrangements.
Trains we preferred to attack because they were always carrying war material on it, or reinforcements for the front. Sometimes you could attack a train going into a tunnel, and you'd get the other end of the tunnel and wait for it and then shoot it up as it came out. It was fun, really, shooting up trains.
During the month of June, Bomber Command flew over 15,000 raids in support of the Allied invasion forces. And by the end of 1944, they'd helped to drive the Germans back in the direction of their own country. Finally, on May the 2nd, 1945, 2 days after Hitler's suicide in Berlin, 126 Mosquitoes took part in the last raid of the war in Europe. Their target, the German port of Kiel. Within 2 hours, the city was reduced to rubble, a grim legacy to the destructive power of the wooden wonder. The aircraft, that had been seen as some sort of joke when it was first designed, went on to prove its doubters irrevocably wrong. And to the men who flew the Mosquito, it was second to none.
It was a love affair, and I thought, well, when I finished flying, that was it. I never flew another aircraft again after the Mosquito, never.
It's wrong, really, to say it was a legend, because the legend suggests it wasn't real, and it was certainly reality. But it was a lovely aircraft, beautiful aircraft to look at, marvellous aircraft to fly.
Well, in many cases, it saved my life, but I mean, I think the Wooden Wonder, it's been used before, but I think the Wooden Wonder really sums it up. It was.
Until as late as 1951, the Mosquito was the Royal Air Force's only all-weather fighter. Altogether, nearly 8,000 of them were built in 41 different variations. In the Second World War, this wooden plane was one of the most feared and effective killers. It became an icon of its time, and a testament to the man who made it possible, Geoffrey de Havilland.